should be returned by the proxy to the client should the file exist, but we can't read it within the proxy. So this part of the code here in our practical. The first step is we need to work out what the error code should be that we need to return. We can find that with a search in Google. HTTP response code. And you'll see there's quite a few sites, but again, we know that our standard sites are the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and the IETF. So I'm going to go to the World Wide Web Consortium as my primary source. And we can see in here that they give a list of all of the different errors that could happen. So we need to work out which one of these is the one that we actually are after. Okay. We know that 1XX ones are informational, and it explains here what each of them are. Okay. These are not to be sent except under experimental conditions. So clearly it's not going to be a 1. If we go on to look at the 2 ones, these are okay or successful ones. Well, clearly if we are not able to give the page, then it's not going to be a successful response. So the request was not successfully received, understood, and accepted. So we are not going to be returning a 2 code. Our 3 ones are redirection. This means that the client would have to go somewhere else to get the information. Well, the client is set up to use this as a proxy, so it's not a redirection. That's the problem. The 400s are bad requests, or sorry, the 4XX are client errors. So these are ones where the client has sent you a request that's not in a valid format, has asked for a file that doesn't exist. But basically it means it's the client error. A lot of people returned 404 not found, but this isn't really the case. The server has not found anything matching the request URI. That's not true. It has found it. It just can't read it. So again, the proxy should be mirroring what would happen if the request had been sent to the origin server. So it was found. We actually retrieved it from the origin server at the proxy, otherwise it wouldn't be in our cache. So it's not actually that the file's not found that the problem occurs. It's actually nothing that the client has done. If the client had sent that request directly to the origin server, it would have worked. The problem is that the proxy server is having difficulties with its file system. So moving on from the client errors, moving into the server errors. This indicates the case where the server is aware that it has an error and incapable of performing the request. Well, clearly this is what's happening. We aren't able to actually perform the request, even though we should be able to. So then we need to look more closely at each of the errors in here. So an internal server error 500, the server encountered an unexpected condition which prevented it from fulfilling the request. Well, that certainly makes sense. Well, 500 internal server error could very well be returned. Not implemented, doesn't support the functionality required. That's not the case. This is certainly not the cases, for instance, if there was an unusual request or something. It doesn't recognize the request method, for instance, and is unable to comply with it, even though it's valid. Okay. Some people use bad gateway, but this is specifically reserved for receiving an invalid request from an upstream server, but it didn't receive an invalid response previously when it accessed the file. It's actually successfully got the file, it just can't read it. And again, we can look through the other ones as well. But clearly the one appropriate one is a 500 internal server error, and quite a few people chose this. One thing further we have to remember is that we can't just print 500 internal server error. If we don't send the response back to the client, it will never know what happened. So we can't print it. We need to actually send it using the client socket.send. Also, another mistake that was common was to send back 500 internal server error, but we have to remember we are responding to an HTTP request, which means that we have to comply with the HTTP response format. So if we have forgotten that, we can look at HTTP response or response format. And again, we're looking for the World Wide Web Consortium, which is not coming up on here. That'd be right. Maybe response structure. There we go. HTTP 1.1 response. And this is the World Wide Web Consortium. So it's, again, for site. And we know it's going to give us definitive protocol requirements. So here's our response format. It requires a status line and a blank line on its own. Everything else is optional, but we must return those in order for it to be a valid HTTP response. The status line is defined here. It has to have the version number, followed by a space, followed by the status code, followed by a space, followed by the reason phrase, and a carriage return line feed. So we can't just send back 500 internal server error. We have to send back HTTP 1.1 500 service error, internal server error, and then a blank line. All of that needs to be sent to the client in response. So that hopefully is a bit clearer for anyone who made the errors there. And remember that you do have access to the specifications, and they're always the best place to go back when working out what to send and receive for the format. And don't forget that whatever protocol you're using, when you're sending or receiving, you have to adhere to the protocol standards.